Throw him in!
Brothers, why are you doing this? Please, do not leave me here. Let him...
There is a strange puzzle hidden in the Bible that most people never notice. If you open the pages that describe the Promised Land and look carefully at the map of Israel, you will see the territories of the tribes spread across the land. Judah, to the south. Benjamin tucked beside it. Reuben beyond the Jordan. Naphtali in the north. Zebulun, Issachar, Asher, Dan, 12 tribes, 12 inheritances, 12 names written into the geography of the nation. But if you search for the son who saved Israel from starvation, the dreamer with the coat of many colors, the man who rose from slavery to rule Egypt, you will discover something shocking. His name is not there. There is no tribe of Joseph on the map. Pause for a moment and let that sink in. Joseph was not a minor character in the story of Israel. He was the son Jacob loved more than all the others. The boy who received the famous coat of many colors. The young dreamer who saw visions of greatness before he was even a man. His brothers hated him for those dreams. They stripped him of his coat. They threw him into a pit, and then they sold him like an animal to traveling merchants heading toward Egypt. From that moment forward, Joseph's life became a chain of injustices and miracles tangled together. A slave in a foreign land. A servant in the house of Potiphar. A prisoner locked away because of a false accusation. Forgotten by the people he helped. Yet somehow, through every betrayal and every setback, Joseph kept rising. Until one day, a desperate Pharaoh called him from prison to interpret a dream no one else could understand, and in a single moment, Joseph went from prisoner to prime minister. He became the second most powerful man in Egypt. When famine struck the ancient world, it was Joseph's wisdom that preserved grain, protected nations, and ultimately saved his own family from starvation. The same brothers who once threw him into a pit eventually stood before him, begging for food, not realizing the ruler they feared was the brother they betrayed. Joseph didn't destroy them. He forgave them. And because of him, the entire family of Israel survived. The nation that would one day become the people of God existed because Joseph preserved it. Which raises a question that should trouble every careful reader of the Bible. If Joseph saved Israel, if Joseph carried the destiny of the family through famine, if Joseph was Jacob's beloved son, then why is there no tribe named after him? Why does his name disappear from the inheritance of the land God promised? When the tribes are listed, we see Judah, Benjamin, Levi, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher. But Joseph's name is strangely absent. At first glance, it almost looks as if history forgot him. As if the man who carried the family through its darkest hour somehow lost his place in the final inheritance. For centuries, readers have stumbled across this mystery without realizing it is even there. But the Bible never leaves puzzles without clues. If you keep reading carefully, you start noticing something unusual. In the list of tribes that inherit the land, 2 names appear that don't quite fit: Ephraim, Manasseh. At first they seem like just 2 more tribal names among the 12. But if you trace them back through the story, you discover something fascinating. They were not sons of Jacob. They were Joseph's sons. 2 boys born in Egypt during Joseph's rise to power, and suddenly the mystery deepens. Why would Joseph's sons receive tribal inheritance, but Joseph himself does not? Why do Ephraim and Manasseh stand where Joseph should have stood? The answer begins in a quiet moment near the end of Jacob's life. An old man lying on his bed, a father preparing to bless the future. Joseph comes to visit him, bringing his 2 sons. And in that moment, Jacob does something unexpected, something so legally and spiritually significant that it changes the structure of the entire nation of Israel. Genesis 48 verse 5 records the moment. And now, your 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, who were born to you in the land of Egypt before I came to you in Egypt, are mine. As Reuben and Simeon, they shall be mine." With those words, Jacob does something astonishing. He adopts Joseph's sons as his own. Ephraim and Manasseh are no longer just grandsons. They become sons of Israel, which means they will inherit land, just like the other tribes. In a single declaration, Joseph's inheritance multiplies. Instead of one tribe bearing his name, 2 tribes rise from his legacy. But the story goes even deeper than that. Because behind this adoption is an ancient law hidden in the traditions of Israel, the law of the firstborn. According to that law, the firstborn son was entitled to a double portion of the inheritance, 2 shares instead of 1, 2 portions of blessing, 2 portions of responsibility, and originally, that birthright belonged to Jacob's firstborn son, Reuben. But something happened that changed everything. A moment of sin, a violation so serious that it disqualified Reuben from his position. And when that happened, the birthright had to go somewhere else. According to 1 Chronicles 5 verses 1 and 2, the inheritance that belonged to the firstborn was transferred to Joseph, the firstborn son of Jacob's beloved wife, Rachel, the brother who had been thrown into a pit, the brother who had been sold into slavery, the brother everyone thought had been erased from the family's future. He ended up receiving the double portion: 2 tribes, 2 inheritances, 2 territories in the Promised Land, which means Joseph was never missing from the map. His blessing had simply multiplied. Sometimes when your name isn't where you think it should be, it's because God has elevated your story in a way that can't fit into just one place. And the mystery of Joseph's disappearance turns out to be one of the greatest reversals in the entire Bible. The pit was not the end of his story. It was the beginning of his double portion. Long before the mystery of the missing tribe, there was simply a boy growing up in a large and complicated family. Jacob had 12 sons, but anyone who lived in that household could see the truth that everyone felt but rarely said aloud. 1 son was loved more than the others. Joseph.Genesis says it plainly. Israel loved Joseph more than all his children because he was the son of his old age. And the love Jacob felt did not stay hidden. It became visible in a gift that would ignite jealousy in the hearts of Joseph's brothers: a coat. Not an ordinary garment, but a coat of many colors, a symbol of favor, privilege, and distinction. In the ancient world, clothing carried meaning. A robe like that told everyone who saw it that this son held a special place in his father's heart. Every time Joseph wore it, the message was clear. He was different. His brothers saw it. They felt it. And slowly, resentment began to grow. At first, it may have been quiet irritation, small glances, frustrated whispers among the older brothers. But Joseph made the situation even worse. Not intentionally, but with the innocence of youth. He started having dreams, strange dreams, powerful dreams. In one dream, Joseph saw sheaves of grain in a field. His brothers' sheaves gathered around and bowed down to his. In another dream, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars bowed before him. Joseph, perhaps too young to realize how dangerous these revelations were, told his brothers exactly what he saw. To them, it sounded like arrogance. To them, it sounded like Joseph believed he would one day rule over them, and hatred that had been quietly forming suddenly hardened. Genesis says they could no longer even speak peacefully to him. Then one day, an opportunity appeared. Joseph's brothers were far from home, tending flocks near Shechem. Jacob sent Joseph to check on them and bring back a report. From a distance, the brothers saw him coming, and even before he arrived, the conversation began. "Here comes that dreamer," they said. In that moment, years of jealousy exploded into something darker. They made a plan, not just to humiliate him, not just to threaten him, but to kill him. They imagined it clearly. They would murder Joseph, throw his body into a pit, and then tell their father a wild animal had devoured him. The dreams would die with him. The favoritism would end. But one brother hesitated. Reuben, the firstborn. He convinced the others not to kill Joseph outright. Instead, they would throw him alive into a dry cistern, a deep pit carved into the ground. Perhaps Reuben hoped to rescue Joseph later. But before that could happen, something else occurred. A caravan approached, traveling, merchants heading to Egypt, and suddenly Judah had an idea. "What profit is it if we kill our brother?" he said. "Let's sell him instead." So they pulled Joseph out of the pit, not to save him, but to sell him for 20 pieces of silver. The favored son of Jacob, the boy with the colorful robe, was handed over like merchandise and carried away toward Egypt. Then the brothers took the coat that once symbolized Joseph's honor, dipped it in goat's blood, and brought it back to their father. Jacob recognized it immediately, and in that moment, a father's heart broke. He believed his beloved son was dead. For years, Jacob mourned Joseph as though he had been torn apart by wild beasts. Meanwhile, Joseph's story was only beginning. In Egypt, he was sold again, this time to a powerful official named Potiphar. Joseph worked faithfully in his master's house, and everything he touched prospered. But blessing sometimes attracts trouble. Potiphar's wife began to desire Joseph. When he refused her advances, she accused him of assault. Joseph was thrown into prison. Another injustice, another pit, another moment where it looked as though Joseph's destiny had been buried. Yet even inside the prison walls, something unusual kept happening. Favor followed him. The prison keeper trusted him. Prisoners came to him with dreams they could not understand, and Joseph interpreted them with remarkable accuracy. One of those prisoners was Pharaoh's cupbearer. Joseph told him he would soon be restored to his position, and he was. Joseph only asked one thing in return: "Remember me." But the cupbearer forgot. For 2 more years, Joseph remained in prison. 2 years of silence. 2 years where it seemed like the story had stalled. Until the night Pharaoh himself began dreaming. Disturbing dreams. Dreams no one in Egypt could explain. And suddenly the cupbearer remembered the Hebrew prisoner who could interpret dreams. Joseph was summoned. In a single day, Joseph went from a forgotten prisoner to standing before the most powerful ruler in the world. He explained Pharaoh's dreams. 7 years of abundance would be followed by 7 years of devastating famine. But Joseph did not only interpret the dream. He offered a plan: store grain during the years of plenty, prepare for the years of hunger. Pharaoh listened, and then he made a decision that changed Joseph's life forever. "You shall be over my house," Pharaoh said. "Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you." Joseph became the governor of Egypt. The prisoner became the ruler. And when the famine finally spread across the land, nations traveled to Egypt for food, including one particular family from Canaan, the family of Jacob. The brothers who had once thrown Joseph into a pit would soon kneel before him, begging for grain, just as his childhood dream had foretold. But the greatest twist of the story was not the rise of Joseph. It was what Joseph chose to do with his power. He forgave them. He preserved them. He saved them. The entire nation of Israel survived because Joseph chose mercy instead of revenge. Which brings us back to the puzzle. How could the man who carried Israel through its darkest hour, the man whose wisdom preserved the family, the man whose dreams shaped the future of a nation, somehow vanish from the list of tribes that inherited the Promised Land? The answer to that mystery begins with 2 boys born far from Canaan, 2 sons Joseph raised in Egypt, Ephraim and Manasseh, and a decision their grandfather Jacob would make that changed everything. Now that we know Joseph's story, the mystery becomes even more unsettling. Because Joseph was not just another son in the family of Jacob. He was the reason the family survived. Without Joseph, the famine would have destroyed them. Without Joseph's wisdom, there would have been no stored grain, No refuge in Egypt, no preservation of the people who would eventually become the nation of Israel. Joseph did not just help his family. He saved the entire future of Israel. So when the time finally came for the people of Israel to enter the land God had promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, it would seem natural that Joseph's name would stand proudly among the tribes receiving territory. But when the tribes are listed, something strange happens. To understand the mystery, imagine standing centuries later with Joshua, as the land of Canaan is finally divided among the tribes. The people have wandered through the wilderness. They have crossed the Jordan River. They have fought battles. Cities have fallen. And now the land is being distributed, tribe by tribe, as an inheritance. The territory of Judah is established in the south. Benjamin receives land close beside it. Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh settle east of the Jordan. In the north, tribes like Naphtali, Zebulun, and Asher take their place. Each tribe receives a portion. Each tribe carries the name of one of Jacob's sons. And when you begin counting them, the number reaches 12. Just as expected, 12 tribes, 12 inheritances, 12 names. But when you start listing them carefully, something begins to feel slightly off. Judah, Benjamin, Reuben, Simeon, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Manasseh, Ephraim. Wait, that's strange. 2 of those names don't belong to Jacob's sons. Manasseh, Ephraim. They are familiar names if you know the story of Joseph. But they are not brothers to the others. They are not sons of Jacob. They are Joseph's sons. And suddenly the puzzle appears in full view. Joseph is missing, but his sons are present. Instead of one tribe named Joseph, there are 2 tribes named after his children, Ephraim, Manasseh. At first glance, it looks like Joseph has disappeared, but if you step back and look again, something else becomes clear. Joseph did not lose an inheritance. His inheritance multiplied. Where every other brother produced a single tribe, Joseph produced 2. Instead of occupying one territory, his legacy spread across 2 regions of the land. The tribe of Ephraim would eventually become one of the most powerful tribes in Israel's history. Many leaders and judges would rise from it, and the northern kingdom itself would later be identified simply as Ephraim. Manasseh, Joseph's other son, would receive a territory so large that it stretched across both sides of the Jordan River. Half of the tribe settled east of the river, and the other half settled west. Joseph's influence was not reduced, it was doubled. Yet even knowing this, the question still lingers. Why? Why would Joseph's inheritance appear in the names of his sons instead of his own name? Why would the map of Israel replace Joseph with Ephraim and Manasseh? To answer that question, we must return to a quiet and deeply emotional moment recorded in the book of Genesis. An aging patriarch lying on his bed. A father nearing the end of his life. Jacob, now called Israel, had lived a long and difficult journey. He had wrestled with angels, fled from enemies, buried loved ones, and carried the weight of leading a family that would one day become a nation. Now the time had come for him to pass on blessings. Joseph came to visit his father during these final days, but Joseph did not come alone. He brought his 2 sons with him, Manasseh, the older, Ephraim, the younger. They had been born in Egypt during Joseph's rise to power, far away from the land of Canaan and far away from the traditions of Jacob's household. But when Jacob saw them, something stirred inside him. What happened next would reshape the structure of Israel forever. Jacob made a declaration that sounded simple, but carried enormous legal and spiritual weight. Genesis 48 verse 5 records the moment. And now your 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, who were born to you in Egypt before I came to you in Egypt, are mine. As Reuben and Simeon, they shall be mine. In other words, Jacob was not just blessing his grandsons, he was adopting them. From that moment forward, Ephraim and Manasseh would not simply be Joseph's children, they would stand as sons of Israel, equal to the other tribes, equal to Reuben, equal to Simeon, equal to Judah. In a single act, Joseph's family line expanded from one branch into 2 tribes. But there is an even deeper layer hidden within that moment. Because Jacob's decision was not random. It was connected to something ancient, something written into the law of inheritance, something known as the birthright. And the birthright carried a powerful privilege. The firstborn son did not receive the same inheritance as the others. He received a double portion. 2 shares of the family blessing, 2 portions of the inheritance, 2 territories instead of 1. And originally, that privilege belonged to Jacob's firstborn son, Reuben. But Reuben had done something that changed the future of the family forever. And because of that moment of failure, the birthright moved, not to Judah, not to Benjamin, but to the very brother they once threw into a pit, Joseph. The son they tried to erase became the one whose inheritance multiplied, and the quiet adoption of Ephraim and Manasseh was the visible sign that the double portion had finally been given. The map of Israel did not forget Joseph. It revealed his elevation. The mystery of Joseph's missing tribe does not begin with a map. It begins in a quiet room in Egypt. An old man lies on a bed, his body weakened by age, but his mind still filled with the weight of a lifetime of promises. This man is Jacob. But by this point in the story, the world knows him by another name, Israel, the one who wrestled with God, the father of 12 sons, the man whose family would become a nation. Years earlier, he believed Joseph had died. For decades, he lived with the grief of losing the son he loved most. But now, in the final chapter of his life, that loss had been reversed in a way no one could have imagined. Joseph was alive. Not only alive, but powerful. The son Jacob mourned had become the ruler of Egypt, and because of Joseph, Jacob and his entire family were now living safely in the land of Goshen, protected from the famine that had swept across the world. But time had continued its quiet work. Jacob was now very old. Genesis tells us his eyes had grown dim with age. His strength was fading. And when Joseph heard that his father was nearing the end of his life, he did something important. He went to see him. But Joseph did not go alone. He brought with him his 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. These boys had grown up in Egypt. Their world was different from the one Jacob had known. They had never lived in Canaan. They had never experienced the wandering life of shepherds that defined their grandfather's early years. But Joseph knew something important. Before Jacob died, his sons needed to receive their grandfather's blessing. In the ancient world, a patriarch's blessing was not just sentimental words spoken over children. It carried prophetic weight. It was believed to shape the destiny of future generations. When Joseph entered the room, something unexpected happened. The old man gathered his strength and sat up in bed. Genesis describes the moment simply but powerfully. Israel strengthened himself and sat up on the bed. Then Jacob began to speak. He remembered the promises God had given him many years earlier, promises about land, descendants, and a future nation. God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan, Jacob said, and blessed me, and said to me, "Behold, I will make you fruitful and multiply you, and I will make of you a company of peoples, and give this land to your offspring after you for an everlasting possession." Jacob was remembering the covenant, the promise that his family would inherit the land of Canaan. But then his words turned toward Joseph's sons, and what he said next changed everything. Genesis 48 verse 5 records it clearly. "And now your 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, who were born to you in Egypt before I came to you in Egypt, are mine. As Reuben and Simeon, they shall be mine." In a single declaration, Jacob performed an act that carried enormous significance. He adopted them. Ephraim and Manasseh were no longer simply Joseph's sons. They became Jacob's sons, equal to the other 12, equal to Reuben, equal to Simeon, equal to Judah. This meant that when the inheritance of the land was eventually divided, Ephraim and Manasseh would receive their own tribal territories. 2 tribes, 2 inheritances, 2 portions. Joseph stood there listening as his father elevated his sons into the structure of Israel itself. But the moment was not finished. Jacob now prepared to bless the boys. Joseph positioned them carefully before his father. Manasseh, the firstborn, stood at Jacob's right hand, the traditional place of the greater blessing. Ephraim, the younger, stood at Jacob's left hand. Everything was arranged according to custom. But something unusual happened as Jacob stretched out his hands to bless them. He crossed them. His right hand rested on Ephraim's head. His left hand rested on Manasseh's head. The younger son received the greater blessing. Joseph noticed immediately. He tried to correct his father. "Not this way, my father," Joseph said, gently guiding his father's hand toward Manasseh. "This one is the firstborn. Put your right hand on his head." But Jacob refused. Though his eyes were dim, his understanding was clear. "I know, my son. I know," he said. "He also shall become a people, and he also shall be great. Nevertheless, his younger brother shall be greater than he." And with that, Jacob sealed the blessing. The younger would surpass the older. Ephraim would rise above Manasseh. It was another example of a pattern that appears again and again in the Bible. Isaac over Ishmael, Jacob over Esau, and now Ephraim over Manasseh. God often overturns human expectations, but the most important detail of this moment was not simply the crossing of Jacob's hands. It was the legal transformation that had already taken place. Ephraim and Manasseh now stood as tribes within Israel, and because they each received an inheritance, Joseph effectively received 2 tribal portions through his sons. What looked like Joseph disappearing from the map was actually something very different. His inheritance had doubled. The tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh became the living proof of a hidden blessing, but the question still remains, why Joseph? Why would Jacob elevate Joseph's family line above the others? Why would Joseph receive 2 portions when every other brother received only 1? The answer lies in an ancient law that governed family inheritance in Israel, a law that gave the firstborn son a unique privilege, the right to a double portion. And once we understand that law, the mystery of Joseph's inheritance becomes one of the greatest reversals in the entire Bible, because the birthright originally belonged to someone else, Jacob's firstborn son, Reuben. But a single moment of sin changed everything, and when Reuben lost the birthright, Joseph became the one who carried it. The brother they threw into the pit ended up receiving the double inheritance. To fully understand what happened in that quiet room in Egypt, we have to look beyond the emotion of the moment and examine the deeper meaning of Jacob's action. Because what Jacob did was not just a touching gesture toward his grandsons. It was a legal transformation. When Jacob said, "Ephraim and Manasseh are mine, as Reuben and Simeon are mine," he was not simply offering affection. In the ancient world, adoption carried powerful legal consequences. Those boys were now counted as his sons, and if they were sons of Israel, that meant they would inherit land exactly the same way the other sons did. That single decision reshaped the structure of the tribes forever. Normally, a father's inheritance was divided among his sons. Each son became the founder of a tribe that carried his name. When the land of Canaan was divided centuries later, each tribe would receive its own territory. But Joseph's situation was suddenly different. Instead of receiving one tribal inheritance like his brothers, Joseph's legacy was now represented through 2 sons who were both counted as patriarchs of tribes, Ephraim, Manasseh. 2 tribes growing from one man. It was something no other brother experienced. Judah had 1 tribe. Benjamin had 1 tribe. Naphtali had 1 tribe. But Joseph's inheritance multiplied. His name did not disappear. his influence expanded. If you imagine the tribal structure like a family tree, every other branch produced one nation-sized limb. Joseph produced two, and this is where the hidden promotion becomes visible, because in a sense, Joseph had been elevated from the level of a brother to something closer to the level of the patriarchs themselves. Think about it. Abraham fathered Isaac. Isaac fathered Jacob. Jacob fathered the tribes. But Joseph's line suddenly split into two, foundational branches of the nation. Ephraim and Manasseh were not simply grandchildren of Israel. They stood among the tribal founders. Joseph's legacy had multiplied inside the very structure of the nation, and history shows just how powerful that multiplication became. The tribe of Ephraim grew into one of the most influential tribes in Israel. In fact, its prominence became so strong that in later centuries the entire northern kingdom of Israel was sometimes referred to simply as Ephraim. Leaders emerged from this tribe. Judges rose from it. Influence spread through it. Meanwhile, the tribe of Manasseh became one of the largest territorial tribes in Israel's history. Its land stretched across vast regions, even occupying territory on both sides of the Jordan River. Half of Manasseh settled east of the river, the other half settled west. Joseph's legacy literally covered enormous sections of the land. Two tribes. Two territories. Two inheritances. The map that once seemed to erase Joseph actually reveals how deeply his blessing spread. But the deeper truth is this. Joseph's promotion had already begun long before Jacob adopted his sons. It began in the pit, when Joseph's brothers stripped him of his robe and threw him into the darkness of that empty cistern. It looked like the end of his story. His dreams appeared shattered. His future looked buried. But that pit was not a burial. It was preparation. Every stage of Joseph's suffering was quietly moving him toward something greater. Slavery in Potiphar's house taught him leadership. Prison taught him endurance. Interpreting dreams prepared him for Pharaoh's palace. And the moment he rose to power in Egypt, Joseph stepped into a role that none of his brothers could have imagined. He became the instrument through which God preserved an entire nation. By the time Jacob adopted Ephraim and Manasseh, Joseph's life had already proven something extraordinary. The brother who had been rejected had become the one through whom the family survived. The brother who had been betrayed had become the one who forgave. The brother who had been sold had become the one who provided. And now, through the adoption of his sons, his inheritance multiplied in a way that fulfilled a much deeper law hidden within the traditions of Israel, a law about the firstborn. In ancient Hebrew culture, the firstborn son carried a special responsibility. He became the primary heir. He received leadership of the family. And most importantly, he received a double portion of the inheritance. Not because he was more loved, but because he carried the responsibility of preserving the family's legacy. The firstborn received 2 shares while the others received 1, which means if a father had 12 sons, the inheritance would be divided into 13 portions. The firstborn would receive 2. This law was written clearly in the Torah. Deuteronomy 21 verse 17 explains it. The firstborn shall acknowledge the son by giving him a double portion of all that he has. The birthright belonged to the firstborn, and in Jacob's family, that firstborn was Reuben. Which raises an important question. If Reuben was the firstborn, then why did Joseph receive the double portion? Why did his inheritance multiply into 2 tribes while the others remained 1? The answer lies in a moment of failure that changed the course of the family forever. Because the birthright can be lost, and when Reuben lost it, the blessing moved. Not to Judah, not to Benjamin, but to Joseph, the brother they once tried to erase. To understand why Joseph received 2 tribes instead of 1, we have to step into the world of ancient Israel and examine a law that governed families, inheritance, and leadership. It was known as the birthright. In modern families, inheritance is often divided equally among children. But in the ancient Near East, the structure was different. Families were organized around a patriarchal system where the firstborn son carried unique responsibility. He was not simply the oldest child. He was the future head of the family. When the father died, the firstborn would step into a position of leadership. He became the protector of the family, the manager of the household resources, and the one responsible for preserving the family's legacy for future generations. Because of that responsibility, the firstborn received something special when the inheritance was distributed, a double portion. The law is written clearly in the Torah. In Deuteronomy 21 verse 17 it says, "He shall acknowledge the firstborn by giving him a double portion of all that he has, for he is the beginning of his strength." The right of the firstborn is his. The principle was simple. If a father had 10 sons, the inheritance would not be divided into 10 equal parts. It would be divided into 11 portions. The firstborn would receive 2. The others would receive 1 each. This was not merely a financial advantage, it was a recognition of leadership. The double portion represented authority, responsibility, and the continuation of the family's future. And in the family of Jacob, the firstborn was Reuben. Reuben was the eldest son of Jacob and Leah. By birth order, the birthright belonged to him. The leadership of the family should have passed through his line. The double portion of inheritance should have belonged to him. Which means when the tribes of Israel eventually received their land, Reuben should have been the one whose legacy expanded beyond the others. But that is not what happened. Instead, when we look at the tribes that inherited the Promised Land, we see Joseph's line producing 2 tribes, Ephraim and Manasseh, while Reuben receives only 1. Something must have happened, and the Bible tells us exactly what it was. Reuben lost the birthright. The story is recorded briefly in Genesis, but its consequences echo through the entire history of Israel. At some point in Jacob's life, Reuben committed a serious act of dishonor against his father. Genesis 35 verse 22 records it in a single sentence. Reuben went and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine, and Israel heard of it. Bilhah was not just any woman. She was Rachel's servant and one of the women who bore children for Jacob. For Reuben to violate his father's concubine was not merely a personal sin. It was an act of rebellion against his father's authority. In the ancient world, such an action carried enormous shame. It was a betrayal of the family order. Though Jacob did not immediately punish Reuben publicly, the consequences came later. When Jacob gathered his sons near the end of his life to speak blessings over them, his words toward Reuben revealed that the birthright had been taken away. In Genesis 49 verses 3 and 4, Jacob said, "Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might and the beginning of my strength. Unstable as water, you shall not excel, because you went up to your father's bed." Those words sealed the verdict. Reuben had lost his position. The firstborn, who should have received the double portion, had disqualified himself, and once the birthright was removed, it had to go somewhere else. But where? This is where the Bible provides a remarkable explanation centuries later. In 1 Chronicles 5 verses 1 and 2, the writer looks back at the story and reveals something that was not obvious at first. Now the sons of Reuben, the firstborn of Israel, he was the firstborn. But because he defiled his father's bed, his birthright was given to the sons of Joseph. Yet Judah prevailed over his brothers, and from him came a ruler, although the birthright was Joseph's. That single passage unlocks the mystery. The birthright moved. Reuben lost it. Joseph received it. But notice something else the verse reveals. Judah received something too. Judah prevailed over his brothers, and from him came a ruler. That means the family inheritance split into 2 distinct roles. The kingship would come through Judah, but the birthright, the double portion, belonged to Joseph. 2 different destinies, Two different responsibilities. From Judah would come the royal line that eventually produced King David, and centuries later, the Messiah. From Joseph came the inheritance of land, expansion, and multiplication. And the physical evidence of that birthright appeared through Jacob's adoption of Ephraim and Manasseh. Two tribes instead of one, two portions of territory in the Promised Land, two branches of influence within the nation of Israel. The brother who had been betrayed by his family ended up receiving the double inheritance that once belonged to the firstborn. It is one of the most powerful reversals in the entire Bible. Joseph began his story in a pit, stripped of his robe, rejected by his brothers, sold as a slave. For years, it looked as if his dreams had been completely destroyed. But behind the scenes, God was rearranging the future. The pit led to slavery. Slavery led to prison. Prison led to Pharaoh's palace. And Pharaoh's palace led to the moment when Jacob adopted Joseph's sons and sealed the double portion into Israel's history. Joseph's name may not appear as a tribe on the map, but his inheritance appears twice: Ephraim, Manasseh. The blessing multiplied, and the brother who had once been rejected became the one whose legacy stretched across the land. But the story still has one more powerful layer. Because Joseph's double portion was not just a legal outcome, it was also a moment of vindication. The dreamer they threw into a pit had become the one whose inheritance could not be contained in a single tribe. Long before Joseph ever stood in Pharaoh's palace, before the famine, before the dreams were fulfilled, there was a position in Jacob's family that carried enormous importance: the position of the firstborn. In ancient cultures, the firstborn son represented strength, authority, and continuity. He was the beginning of the father's legacy. When the father died, the firstborn would carry the family forward. Reuben held that position. He was Jacob's first child, the first son born to Leah. When Jacob looked at Reuben as a baby, he likely believed the future leadership of the family rested in that child, and for many years, that was probably true. Reuben grew up as the eldest among 12 brothers. He would have naturally held influence among them. The younger brothers would look to him. Responsibility would fall on his shoulders. But something changed. Somewhere along the way, Reuben made a decision that would alter the destiny of his family forever. Genesis records the moment in only one sentence, almost as if the Bible refuses to dwell on the shame of it. Reuben went and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine, and Israel heard of it. At first glance, the verse feels abrupt, almost strangely brief for something that carries such heavy consequences. But in the culture of that time, the act carried enormous meaning. Bilhah was not simply another woman in the household. She was Rachel's servant, the woman who had borne 2 of Jacob's sons, Dan and Naphtali. To violate his father's concubine was more than a personal failure. It was a public act of rebellion. In the ancient world, sleeping with a patriarch's concubine could be interpreted as an attempt to assert authority over the household. It was a challenge to the father's leadership and an insult to his honor. Reuben crossed a boundary that should never have been crossed, and though Jacob did not immediately confront him in that moment, the silence did not mean the offense was forgotten. Years later, when Jacob gathered his sons together near the end of his life, the truth finally surfaced. One by one, he spoke prophetic words over each of them. When he turned to Reuben, his voice carried both sorrow and disappointment. Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might and the beginning of my strength, the excellency of dignity and the excellency of power. For a moment, the words sound like praise. Jacob acknowledges Reuben's position, the firstborn, the beginning of his strength, but then the tone changes. Unstable as water, you shall not excel. The words cut sharply. Unstable, not firm, not reliable, not able to carry the weight of leadership. And then Jacob reveals the reason. Because you went up to your father's bed, then you defiled it. In that moment, the consequences of Reuben's earlier decision become clear. He would not excel. The birthright would not continue through him. The double portion would not belong to his descendants. Reuben had been first in birth, but he would not be first in inheritance. The privilege that should have belonged to him would pass to another, and that is where Joseph enters the story again. For years, Joseph's life had looked like a chain of losses. He lost his father's protection. He lost his freedom. He lost his homeland. He lost years of his life inside prison walls. But while Joseph was enduring those hardships, something was quietly shifting in the spiritual structure of the family. The birthright was moving. 1 Chronicles 5 verses 1 and 2 explains it clearly. Now the sons of Reuben, the firstborn of Israel, because he defiled his father's bed, his birthright was given to the sons of Joseph. That means Joseph did not receive the double portion by accident. He received it legally. Reuben lost it. Joseph inherited it. But notice the wording carefully. The birthright was given to the sons of Joseph. That is exactly what we saw happen when Jacob adopted Ephraim and Manasseh. The inheritance passed through them, 2 tribes, 2 territories, 2 portions of the promised land. Reuben still existed as a tribe, but he no longer carried the privilege of the firstborn. His territory remained relatively small and eventually faded in influence compared to others. Joseph's line, however, expanded. Ephraim became one of the most powerful tribes in Israel. Manasseh spread across a vast territory. The birthright had clearly shifted, and this contrast between Reuben and Joseph reveals one of the deepest lessons hidden in the story. Reuben was born into privilege. Joseph was rejected by his brothers. Reuben started with honor. Joseph started in a pit. Yet by the end of the story, the positions were reversed. The brother who should have inherited the double portion lost it through instability. The brother who suffered betrayal gained it through faithfulness and perseverance. Joseph never forced his way into power. He never sought revenge against his brothers. Even when he had the authority to destroy them, he chose mercy, and in the end, the inheritance found its way to him. 2 tribes, 2 portions, 2 inheritances that stretched across the promised land. The story that began with jealousy and betrayal ended with one of the most powerful vindications in the Bible. The dreamer they tried to silence became the one whose legacy multiplied beyond theirs. When Joseph was 17 years old, standing in a field wearing the coat his father had given him, no one could have imagined how his story would end. Not his brothers, not the merchants who bought him, not the prison guards who locked him away, and perhaps not even Joseph himself. Because the path that led to Joseph's inheritance did not look like a path to greatness. It looked like a descent. First came the pit, a dry cistern carved into the earth where his brothers threw him after stripping away the robe that symbolized his father's love. In that moment, Joseph's dreams must have seemed painfully distant. The boy who once dreamed of leadership now sat alone in darkness. Then came the sale. 20 pieces of silver. That was the price his brothers accepted to send him away forever. To them, Joseph was no longer a brother. He was merchandise. From the pit he was carried to Egypt, a foreign land where his name, his language, and his family meant nothing. Then came slavery. Joseph became property in the house of Potiphar. His life was no longer his own. Yet even there, something unusual happened. Everything Joseph touched began to prosper. Potiphar noticed it. Trust grew. Responsibility increased. But just as Joseph's life seemed to stabilize, another betrayal struck. False accusation. Potiphar's wife, angry that Joseph refused her advances, accused him of a crime he did not commit. And once again, Joseph found himself in a place that looked like the end of his story. Prison. Another pit. Another dark chapter where it seemed like the dreams of his youth had been buried. Years passed. Joseph helped others inside the prison. He interpreted dreams. He showed wisdom and compassion. But even after correctly interpreting the cupbearer's dream and asking only to be remembered, Joseph was forgotten. 2 more years slipped by in silence. From the outside, Joseph's life looked like a long sequence of disappointments, betrayal, slavery, prison, delay. But what Joseph could not see at the time was that every step was moving him toward something greater. The pit led him to Egypt. Egypt led him to Potiphar's house. Potiphar's house led him to prison, and prison led him to Pharaoh. The moment Pharaoh dreamed of famine, Joseph's entire life suddenly made sense. All the preparation, all the suffering, all the waiting. Joseph stood before the most powerful ruler in the ancient world and revealed the meaning of the dream. 7 years of abundance, 7 years of famine, crisis that would devastate nations. But Joseph did more than interpret the dream. He offered the solution. Store grain during the years of plenty. Prepare for the years of scarcity. Pharaoh recognized something extraordinary in Joseph. Wisdom, discernment, leadership, and so the Hebrew slave became the governor of Egypt. The prisoner became the administrator of the largest empire in the region. And when the famine finally came, people from every direction traveled to Egypt to survive, including the brothers who once threw Joseph into a pit. They bowed before him, exactly as Joseph's childhood dreams had shown. But Joseph did not crush them. He forgave them, and in one of fawn, the most profound moments of the entire story, Joseph revealed how he understood everything that had happened to him. "You meant evil against me," he told them, "but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive." Those words explain not only Joseph's rise to power, they explain his inheritance. Because while Joseph was enduring suffering, God was quietly rearranging the future. The brother they tried to erase became the one who preserved them. The dream they mocked became the destiny they fulfilled. And the inheritance that should have belonged to the firstborn eventually found its way to the brother who had been rejected. Joseph's story ends not with one tribe carrying his name, but with 2, Ephraim, Manasseh, 2 tribes spreading across the land of promise. 2 inheritances flowing from the life of the boy who once sat alone in a pit. Joseph's name may not appear on the tribal map, but his legacy appears twice. That is the ultimate vindication. The brother they tried to destroy became the one whose blessing multiplied. The mystery of Joseph's missing tribe carries a lesson that reaches far beyond ancient history. At first glance, it looks like Joseph disappears from the inheritance of Israel. His name is not listed among the tribes. His place on the map seems to vanish. But when you look closer, you realize something powerful. Joseph was not erased, he was elevated. Instead of 1 tribe, his legacy became 2. Instead of a single inheritance, he received a double portion. The very thing that once looked like absence was actually multiplication. And sometimes, life works the same way. There are moments when it feels like your name has disappeared from the places you expected to see it. Opportunities vanish. Recognition fades. Dreams seem delayed, and it can feel as though your story has been pushed aside. But Joseph's life reminds us that what looks like loss on the surface may actually be preparation beneath the surface. The pit did not cancel Joseph's destiny. The prison did not erase his future, and the missing tribe did not mean his inheritance was gone. It meant his blessing had multiplied. Sometimes when your name isn't where you expected it to be, it's because God is writing your story in a way that cannot fit into a single place. And just like Joseph, the chapter that once looked like disappearance may turn out to be the beginning of a double portion. If you enjoy uncovering powerful mysteries hidden in the Bible, make sure you subscribe to the channel and like the video, because there are many more incredible stories waiting to be discovered.